it's a great pleasure to be with you. And Srijit has said it correctly, that the Dilli Chalo movement, the farmers' movement, the general strike on November 26th was the best birthday present to Frederick Engels possible. And I think it's really important that we recognize that, of course, that's not a one-day strike. The strike is still going on, and the struggle is still happening in Delhi. Farmers are determined, agricultural workers are determined to continue their struggle, and I think we should keep them in mind when we think about people like Engels, the theory of Marxism that is so important for an understanding of the dynamic of history and the dynamic towards liberation, which is slightly different. The first thing I'd just like to say is that we have right now a current issue of People's Democracy, which you can read on the web. It's the whole issue, almost the whole issue, is to commemorate the life and legacy of Frederick Engels. There are some fantastic articles there. Comrade Sitaram Yechuri has an overview of Engels' contributions. Comrade Brinda Karat has a piece on Engels' interventions in the condition of the working class in England and also origins of the family. It's a fantastic essay. Comrade Probir Purkayastha has a piece on reading Engels as a scientist in our time after over 150 years of his major texts on science. So I highly recommend you go and read the issue of People's Democracy. I think you'll find it very useful. Study some of the articles carefully. I also want to say that I'm very grateful, very, very grateful, to Rafiq for inviting me. The Dialectic Research Forum has an excellent series, and I know from the people that you've chosen to contribute in the rest of the series that they will go into much more depth into each of the aspects and contribution of Frederick Engels. It's my task to give an overview. I don't presume to go too deeply into any aspect except one of them, which is the important discovery by Engels and Marx of the proletariat. I'm going to spend most of my time on that aspect. So, Rafiq, again, thank you, comrade. And you know, of course, that the word Rafiq in Arabic means comrade. So, Rafiq is well named, and you might want to just call him Rafiq. He's a well-named comrade. I'm glad that he has invited me, and I'm happy to be with you. So let me go into Engels as the pioneer of communism. The first thing I want to say is on the 5th of August, 1895, Comrade Engels died. And when he died on the 5th of August, 22 days later, on the 27th of August, Eleanor Aveling, Lesser and Bernstein took Engels' ashes to the English seaside town of Bournemouth, and they went into the water and as far as they could go, and they threw his ashes into the water. So Engels never actually had a grave or a memorial, which is very fitting for Frederick Engels. Frederick Engels devoted his life to the working class. Frederick Engels devoted his life to his friend's work, his friend being, of course, Karl Marx. Frederick Engels always said, my contribution is insignificant. When you read his many prefaces to Marx's works, including Capital Volume 2, he writes, my contribution, he writes of his own hard work. My contribution was insignificant, he says. It's fitting, of course, then that he just wanted his ashes thrown into the ocean. There is no grave site for Frederick Engels. It's very rare that people commemorate Engels. You know, there is a large grave for Marx in Highgate in London. There is no place where people can go and offer their love and consideration for Frederick Engels. It's part of his personality that we should consider this. When he died, a very young Russian Marxist, very, very young Russian Marxist, wrote a contribution to Engels for his life. And he quoted in his contribution the Russian poet Nekrasov. And what this young Russian Marxist wrote, quoting the poet Nekrasov, he wrote, "What a torch of reason ceased to burn, what a heart has ceased to beat." What a torch of reason ceased to burn, what a heart has ceased to beat. This Russian Marxist, of course, was Vladimir Ulanov Lenin. Lenin wrote this as one of his early writings, 1895, writings about Engels. Later, he would write about Engels quite a bit and try to lift up Engels' contribution to the development of Marxism. We're talking about a man who grew up in some affluence. His father was a factory owner. He very early in his life decided to turn his back to his own class origin, decided to throw in his lot with the revolutionary movements, first in Germany and then all across Europe and eventually globally. As a very young man, he decided that the hypocrisies of his own class were not something that he was going to allow to define him for the rest of his life. Again, as I said, a humble person who threw himself into the struggle and threw himself into the work of his great friend and his partner, Karl Marx. Now, the first section of this presentation is going to be about the discovery of the proletariat. Before Engels was sent by his father to England to help work at the factory that his father partly owned in Manchester, before that, he was taken up with two currents of thought, revolutionary thought nonetheless, but two currents of thought which had some similarities. Engels, like Marx, was greatly influenced by Hegel, by the German philosopher Hegel. Hegel's idea was that philosophy itself needed to bring reason into the world, that reason wasn't available around us. We needed to bring reason into the world. And that was Hegel's main contribution. The young Hegelians, including the philosopher Bruno Bauer, who was a very close mentor to Marx in his very early years, and somebody that Engels admired, Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians used Hegel's ideas to criticize religion. Their argument was essentially we have to flip around the idea that God is the finished product of history. The finished product of history must be on the earth. That we need a kind of secular humanism to drive historical progress, not a spiritual divinity to drive good in the world, and so on. Both Engels and Marx broke with the young Hegelians pretty early, but they didn't know exactly where to go. They were influenced by French utopian socialists like Fourier and Saint-Simon. There was an influence there, but they found them very limited because they found them to be too idealistic. People like Fourier and Saint-Simon believed that in any situation you could just break with capitalism, and rather than utilize money, you create your own forms of money and so on. There was something very idealistic about Fourierism, about Saint-Simon and so on. But nonetheless, utopian socialists did to some extent influence Engels and Marx as well. Later, they will attack them quite strongly. The second major influence on Engels and also on Marx was the philosophical communism. It's a very important trend. The philosophical communism of Moses Hess. Moses, like the prophet Moses, and Hess, Hess. Moses Hess was an interesting man who came amongst Marx and Engels and their circle, and he made the argument that in a future society, people needed to have a kind of, equality. They needed a kind of kingdom of heaven on earth. They needed to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. But who was going to do this? Who was going to be the agent of history? Who was going to bring heaven down to earth? And here Moses Hess argued that the philosophers play a role. The middle class intellectual brings, in a way, heaven down to earth. This was a very important trend of thinking that influenced Marx and Engels in the early period. When Engels goes first to England in 1844 to work in his father's factory, Marx is in Paris. Marx is writing in manuscripts a lot of his ideas. These texts would be published only, almost 100 years later in the 1930s, 90 years later. These are called the economic and philosophical manuscripts, also known as the Paris manuscripts. When you read the economic and philosophical manuscripts or the Paris manuscripts, you see that here Marx is essentially, in many respects, a philosophical communist. He begins to understand the importance of communism, the importance of moving beyond capitalism, that the solutions to the great problems of inequality and the great advantage of social wealth. You see, the utopian socialists, Fourier, Saint-Simon, they were greatly moved by inequality. But they were not able to see that capitalism had advanced the productive forces and had created social wealth. They were utopians. They didn't see that there was a need to socialize the means of production, socialize the forces of production, in a sense, transform society from capitalism to socialism. They wanted to move from inequality to socialism, not from capitalism to socialism. Their thinking was different. They were not able to see that capitalism had advanced human civilization, had produced the socialization of labor, and therefore had created the possibility of moving beyond what Engels called the kingdom of necessity, where we are in a general sense of poverty. How do you move beyond that? Well, Marx had come to an understanding in the Paris manuscripts, and so did Moses Hess, that capitalism produces wealth, generates wealth, but it's not capitalism that generates wealth. It's the capitalist forces that socialize labor, that bring labor into a new mode of production, which is able to generate vast amount of social wealth, and that needs to be socialized. So they were not idealists. They were, in that sense, already becoming materialists. But Moses Hess didn't understand that the proletariat needs to act in history. Moses Hess believed that the middle class must act in history. Okay, so let's stop with Moses Hess for a minute and move back to Engels going to England. So Marx, comes to these same understandings and starts going beyond Moses Hess in the philosophical economic manuscripts of 1844. Exactly this moment Engels is in England, where Engels is amongst the workers of Manchester. This is the first time that Engels has seen the working class up close. Now, we know that in 1844 in Paris, Marx had a number of meetings with Parisian artisans. We know that this experience had an incredible impact on Marx's thinking, on his work. But these were artisans, and many of his comrades in Germany who came into exile in France, later in Holland when Marx goes there, Brussels, and then in London, the German exiles who were communists, who were eventually, whether they were anarchists or they would become Marxists, many of them were artisans because they were not part of a proletarian and industrial working class movement in Germany. They were artisans who were being displaced and had radicalized. So Marx had an experience of artisans, and this is very clear in the philosophical and economic manuscripts. This artisanal, displaced artisanal, contribution to his thinking. You see this in Marx Capital Volume 1, where there is an enormous section toward the end on the displacement of the artisans. And Marx writes with so much feeling about how the artisans are being displaced by the capitalist mode of production. You'll remember that he's also writing about his friends. This is not an abstract text. He's writing about the early communists that he knew who were displaced artisans. Okay, but Engels in Manchester has a much clearer understanding of the factory-based industrial working class, not the displaced artisans, not people displaced from small manufacturing units. Engels will write in the preface to his condition of the working class in England. He writes, "I forsook the company and the dinner parties, the port wine." Now remember, Engels goes there as a manager of his father's factory. So he could have just spent his time with other managers, the upper middle class, and so on. So it's in this context that he's writing in the preface to the condition of the working class in England. He writes, I gave up the company and the dinner parties, the port wine and the champagne of the middle classes, and devoted my leisure hours almost exclusively to the intercourse with plain working men. I am both glad and proud to have done so. I am both proud and glad to have done so. He spends his time amongst the industrial working class. He falls in love with a worker, Lizzie Burns. They begin to live together and live together for decades. He becomes, as much as possible, part of the working class world because he wants to learn from the working class. He writes later, while I was in Manchester, it was tangibly brought home to me that the economic facts, which have so far played no role or only a contemptible one in the writing of history, are at least in the modern world a decisive historical force. What he's saying is, I discovered that economics, what would at the time be called political economy, the writing about how wealth is generated, earlier the writings of Adam Smith, and then closer to Engels' own time, David Ricardo, whose Origins was published in 1817, just a couple of decades before Engels goes to Manchester. He's been reading some of these texts, as is Marx, and he'll say, these texts, this economics, this political economy, this is a developed system of licensed fraud, he says, because these thinkers, they essentially are writing the middle class point of view, the bourgeois point of view, the point of view of factory owners. They are looking at economic events from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie. This is as much so for senior people like Senior, and it is as much so for people like Adam Smith, but closer to home, actually, David Ricardo, not so much Smith. Smith was in an earlier era. So Engels begins to take an interest in economic theory. He begins to read economic theory, and he begins to look carefully at the condition of the working class of England. Now, the issue with Engels is that he begins to publish some of his texts, early texts. These are published in the journal Vorwärts. They are published in the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch, which ran for a few years. This is a text edited partly by Marx. In 1843, he starts to publish some of these early texts. Eventually, he will publish a text called Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy. Very important early text by Engels trying to work out how the economic system is functioning, this idea of the concreteness of capitalism. Earlier they were writing philosophically about inequality, about the human condition, about alienation, and so on. Now he has become, in a sense, an ethnographer, an anthropologist of the factory. And his book, when it comes out eventually in 1845, The Condition of the Working Class in England, is the first real ethnography or anthropology of factory life. It's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it. Later, in 1859, when Marx writes the contribution to the critique of political economy, he refers to Engels' outline from about 12, 13 years previously and said it's a brilliant sketch on the criticism of economic categories. I don't want you to underestimate the role that Engels plays in some of these matters. Okay, let's go ahead. So, initially, when Engels encounters the factory system, he's quite stunned by it initially, but he's also perplexed because politically in England, there was a movement called the Chartist Movement. This was a working class movement developed, led by, run by working class activists and artisans. They were very much at the center of this movement. And their claim was, they said, we have a charter. We want a constitution in England. We don't believe that we should be governed by a parliament, which is a unity of landlords, aristocrats, and the factory owners. We would like the working people to enter a dispute, a direct political dispute with the aristocrats, the landowners and the factory owners. We want a political dispute. We want to enter parliament. We have a charter of demands. Engels was initially quite dismayed, and he wrote, when people here speak of Chartism and radicals, they almost always have in mind the lower strata of society, the mass of proletarians. And it is true that the party's few educated spokesmen are lost among the masses. See, because he first comes to England with the idea of philosophical communism, of Moses Hess, that the middle class must lead, a radicalized middle class must lead the struggle, that philosophy has to be injected into the working class. That's the philosophical communism idea, that the working class, in a sense, must be led by the philosophers. This is their early idea. So he is not clear what's going on here. Why in this Chartism do you have working class leaders? In fact, it's quite interesting. In December 1844, he writes, up to the present time, our stronghold is the middle class, a fact which will perhaps astonish the English reader if he does not know that this class is far more disinterested, impartial, and intelligent than in England. He's writing about Germany. He's saying in England, you'll be surprised to know that the leading class in Germany is the middle class. He says that's the class that's going to make the revolution. And he says in Germany, the revolution will happen in philosophy. It's going to be a philosophical communism that is going to lead the day. This is in December 1844. And look at this. In September of 1845, his opinion changes completely. So in the course of less than a year, he's going to change his opinion. In September 1845, this is what he writes. He writes, it is true that there are among our middle classes a considerable number of Republicans and even communists who, if a general outbreak occurred now, would be very, very useful in the movement. But these men are bourgeois, profit mongers, manufacturers by profession, and who will guarantee us that they will not be demoralized by their trade, by their social position, which forces them to live on the toil of other people, to grow fat by being the leeches, the exploiters of the working classes. Fortunately, we do not count on the middle class at all. So, in December 1844, he says the leadership must come from the middle class, that the working class must just follow, must not contribute in any way. That's in September 1844. Then in December 1844. Then in September 1845, he turns around and says, no, it's the proletarians that must lead the middle class. The proletarians are the vanguard. Now, what has happened to him that he's changed his opinion in less than a year? I'm going to read some more quotations and then I'll try to put it together, okay? He says that, here it is. He says in the preface again to the contribution, the condition of the working class in Manchester, he writes, having ample opportunity to watch the middle classes, your opponents, he's writing to the workers' movement, I soon came to the conclusion that you are right, perfectly right, in expecting no support whatsoever from them. Now, he takes a rather sectarian turn here because no support whatsoever is a little far. But his point is clear. He's begun in his investigation of the factory condition in Manchester. He's begun to understand a few important things. He's begun to understand a couple of important things, and I'm going to go one by one over them. And what did he discover? What did he learn? How did he uncover the importance of the proletariat? Because this is what Engels uncovers. This is what he brings to Marx when he goes back to Paris and when they are sitting in Brussels. This is Engels' real principal discovery. Okay, so let me go over one by one. What are the various things that Engels discovered? So what did he discover? Firstly, he discovered that the working class that comes to a city where they work in many different factories are in enormous concentration. There are many, many workers in each of the factories, and cities then take on the character of the working class. He writes in The Condition of the Working Class, he says, if the centralization of population stimulates and develops the property holding class, if it creates a bourgeoisie, it forces the development of the workers yet more rapidly. The workers begin to feel as a class, as a whole. They begin to perceive that though feeble as individuals, they form a power united. Their separation from the bourgeoisie, the development of views peculiar to the workers, that means particular to the workers, and corresponding to the position in life is fostered. The consciousness of opposition awakens, and the workers attain social and political importance. So now look what he's saying. He's saying that the development of history or historical materialism produces a certain set of events. The development of economic forces, the forces of production, brings together massive numbers of workers into factories because the factory form is the most efficient form of production as far as the capitalists understand it. It's the process of historical materialism, the development of history, that creates the factory form. It's not the philosopher that creates the factory form. It's the anarchic process of history, which has a great logic underneath it. It's anarchic because the capitalists are competing with each other, but there is a great logic underneath it, which Marx will discover and write about in Capital later. But Engels says that it's the factory form that brings together an enormous number of workers, firstly to work in a factory, but that's not the key. They also live in working class neighborhoods. In these working class neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods of workers, a culture develops, the culture of proletariats. A culture develops. The workers in their struggles, because they struggle to lessen the working day, the fight for the 10-hour day and so on. These fights come because it is intolerable. The conditions of factory life are intolerable. Engels will describe them, but you don't need somebody from outside telling you it's intolerable. The workers know it's intolerable. Marx will write in Capital Volume 1 that the limit of the working day is the day itself. The capitalist keeps trying to take as much from the worker as possible, and that's the class struggle. The class struggle is inside the demands of the capitalists and the attempt by the worker first to survive, to fight to survive, and eventually to come to an understanding that the system itself is rotten and is preventing their survival. So Engels says that it's the process of historical development that produces the factory form. The factory form produces working class neighborhoods. Later in 1872, Engels will come back and write a text called The Housing Question, a series of articles about the workers' housing conditions, where workers live, how this living condition produces a certain consciousness amongst the working class. A proletarian consciousness develops. For the first time in world history, the working class understands itself as a class in itself. It's not just a class that exists abstractly. Workers begin to have consciousness of their unified situation. That's why he says they may be feeble as individuals, but as a class, they form a power united. They begin to understand this in their various struggles and so on. They develop views peculiar, he says, or particular to the workers. The consciousness is beginning to develop. So the role of the Marxist, let's call him a Marxist, although he's not a Marxist yet, because even Marx isn't a Marxist yet. The role of a communist, say, like Engels, is to go amongst the people. That's what he writes in his preface. Go amongst the people, and from the people learn the levels of their thinking about what the historical development has produced in their lives. The philosopher doesn't construct abstractly the ideas of, well, what is the state of the world today? You can't, as a research methodology, that's what Engels is teaching us, as a research methodology. You can't sit in your room and write about the condition of the working class. You have to go amongst the workers, and you're not just writing about the condition of working class lives, how much people eat, where they live, what they do, and so on. But the method, the great method of communism that Engels discovers is that you have to have the workers be a participant in your research. You must learn from the workers how workers are seeing the world. And if you grasp how workers are seeing the world, you're able then to theorize the world from the standpoint of the worker, from the standpoint of the proletariat. This is the great methodological advance of Frederick Engels. This is what he's going to bring to Marx. And I want to emphasize this. I'm going to make this point again, because I don't want this to be lost. The great methodological advance. The most of the radical thinking that Marx and Engels encountered before 1845 or thereabouts had suggested that in philosophy is reason, and this reason in philosophy must develop as philosophy, and then it is this reason which has to be injected into the world. The world is an unreasonable place. You have to inject reason into the world. In early period, it was fairly abstract philosophy. At the time of the young Hegelians, they begin to understand that you have to actually address problems in the world outside. And the German young Hegelians were quite, ferocious about this, because they wanted a republic. They didn't want a king of Prussia. They didn't want barons. They didn't want aristocracies. They wanted a kind of constitution. They were inspired by French republicanism and so on. But still, they felt that they will create the ideas in their head, and then they will bring the idea into the world. That was the key thing of the prior to 1845. That was the key thing, is that the idea must be brought into the world. Engels' methodological incredible advance was that no, ideas don't come into the world to make history. The process of history has its own internal dialectic, and it's the role of the communists to study in collaboration with the working class, in talking and listening to the working class. It's the role of the communist militant to be amongst the workers, to derive from the workers their sense of history, their sense of struggle, their sense of their own conditions. It's the collaboration between the communist, who in many cases is of the working class, but not necessarily so. Engels, not necessarily so. Who goes amongst the people, who learns from the people not only the state of their lives, but also how they're understanding their lives. What are their concepts? And it is that then furnishes you with the theoretical armor. And I'm going to come back to what you do with that. When you can write, say, political economy, not from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie, but the standpoint of the proletariat. That's what Engels starts to work out in his first outline of political economy, which Marx later says is an essential text. That's what Marx will start to do after when he first writes the Grundrisse, his great manuscript text from 1857-58, then the contribution to the critique of political economy, eventually Capital. Okay, I'm going to come back to this major theoretical advance. But you begin to see after 1845, Engels starts writing about the importance of Chartism even, and of working class struggle. I mean, here he is, after 1845, he writes, that the antithesis in England is the antithesis between the people and the aristocracy, and democracy is what they are going to fight for. He says the constitution repudiates property and the middle class. The struggle for democracy against aristocracy in England is the struggle of the poor against the rich. The democracy toward which England is moving is a social democracy. He revises his thinking about the Chartists. He begins to understand the importance of a working class, a proletarian-led political struggle. I hope I'm making myself clear with all this. Anyway, okay, so I think we have enough on this. Just to underline, it's the process of history that produces revolutionary developments. It's not the intervention of the philosopher. The philosopher, Moses Hess, very early Marx, very early Engels, the philosopher doesn't come in and actually advance everything. It's the process of history. Okay, so that's that part. I hope I've been clear enough. Then he will return to meet Marx in Paris. They will begin to settle accounts, what they call settle accounts together. They will write a series of very important texts. Most of these texts are not published. We're not talking about Marx here, but this is Marx's problem. Marx wrote so many things. He was so unhappy with the condition of what he was doing, he just didn't publish it. So they would write The Holy Family, that was published. A very strong critique of Bruno Bauer, their former mentor. They will write The German Ideology, which is a critique not only of German idealism, but also French idealism, of the French utopian socialists and so on. Very strong books. This is in 1845, The Holy Family, 1846-47, The German Ideology, which is not published. You see, at this point, in 1846-47, they get involved with the communist movement, and they are asked to produce a text, Marx and Engels together, they are asked to produce a text which would summarize the developments of communism. And it's so important. The reason this text is a key breakthrough is it's the first time Marx and Engels together will put into a text this understanding of the proletariat driving forward the development of history, and not the philosopher. Initially, Engels will write a summary text in 1847, which is published as Principles of Communism. And I'm really happy to say that our comrades in Tamil Nadu have just released this text in Tamil. This is Bharatiya Puttakalam. And today, all across Tamil Nadu, there's public readings of this text, Principles of Communism. It's a very short, brief text. It's a catechism, like a religious text. There are questions. What is communism? He answers it. Then, what is the proletariat? That's the second question. It's quite interesting. Maybe I should read the answer to that. What is the proletariat? And he writes, the proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose whole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat, or the class of proletarians, is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century. Very clear idea that the proletariat survives by selling labor power, what Marx will later call labor power. This is in 1847. This is the early draft that they use in order to then sit together, and Marx will mainly draft the Communist Manifesto in 1848. A key text, because now these principles of communism are inside the manifesto. And the main breakthrough is that it is the proletarian class, because of their role in world history, having created a culture that understands both capitalism and that one must supersede capitalism. Both capitalism. You see, other classes, the peasantry, artisans and so on, they may have a attitude of anger and frustration towards capitalism. But in many cases, except if the people are in big factory farms. In many cases, the small peasant, the small artisan is not able to see the possibilities of going beyond capitalism to socialism. That's how they understood it in 1848. So the key class is the proletarian. And in a sense, there's a great validity to that. So they settle accounts with German idealism. And in 1847, Engels will put forward his principles of communism, and Marx will write, and Marx and Engels will together publish the Communist Manifesto. This is a key period because now they've come before the world radical community and they've said, this is how we understand things, that there is a driving force of history. There is a certain dynamic, not inevitability, but a dynamic within the economic and social development of society. There is a dynamic that leads us to the creation of the factory form. The factory form produces the proletariat. The proletariat develop an understanding of the immense possibilities of capitalism and the need to transcend capitalism towards socialism. This is what they discover in 1848. And that's why, to some extent, there's a little bit of great admiration for capitalism in that text, that capitalism agglomerates all this wealth and it produces a great advance and so on. So that exactly, that piece of it is a huge advance, and it's available in the text itself. Okay, so then I'd like to switch in the last 20 odd minutes to two other aspects of his life that I think are quite important. The first aspect is that he then begins to, he and Marx together begin to understand and study much more deeply the way in which both the capitalist form has to be understood, and also how the science of political economy must be understood. You read their correspondence between Marx and Engels. They will write at several instances how Marx will ask Engels questions. He will ask him for material. He will ask him for his help. And you see Engels writing commentaries back to Marx. They debate and discuss and so on. This is a very rich period for them between 1848 and the 1860s, when Marx is writing Capital. That's one dimension of their collaboration. And it's very hard to think of Marx's Capital 1 and of course 2 and 3 without the hand of Engels. They really collaborated through this period. And I'm going to say a few things in a minute about how Engels' role in this is disparaged. He is made light of, and I think that's quite unfortunate from my perspective, because after all, Engels made the principal breakthrough, in my opinion, bringing the proletariat to the center of thinking, not just the condition of the proletariat, because even liberals can worry about the condition of the proletariat, inequality and so on. But the breakthrough of communism isn't what is the condition of the proletariat. It's can we understand the world through a proletarian consciousness. That's what Marxism is about. That's an enormous breakthrough. Big break from liberalism, from anarchism, from utopian socialism and so on. Okay, that's the key thing, and that comes from Engels. So that's why I say we must not disparage the role of Engels in all of this. Okay. Now, the other thing that they start collaborating on, which Engels will continue through the rest of his life, is he will write as a propagandist of the institutions of internationalism. They don't create the first international until around the time of the Paris Commune in 1872. That's true. But before, from the 1840s until 1872, Engels and Marx are corresponding with radicals across the continent. When the Communist Manifesto is published, there is a general rebellion all across Europe. And that rebellion is put down. Then for the next period, both Marx and Engels will spend some time, quite a lot of time actually, trying to understand, why this crackdown happened, what were the limitations in the working class movement and so on. They will spend a great deal of time. They will write various texts. I just want to read you some of the names of the texts that they produce. they will write, Marx will of course write his 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, but Engels will turn to understanding in his text on Germany. He will turn to understanding why is it that the German working class was defeated. He goes back to the 16th century, writes about the Peasant War and so on. They are working as journalists, they are working as historians, and also they are working as the correspondents with a range of radicals across Europe. And you can see in Engels his journalistic writings, how well informed he was, writing about the United States, writing about Germany, France, and so on. He was corresponding with the leading radicals of his time. He was drawing from their thinking, and he was able to summarize. This is actually a real important thing. If you want to understand left-wing journalism, I highly recommend you read Engels' journalistic writings, because Engels is able to quickly summarize the essence of what's going on in a place from the standpoint of the workers' movement. And there are brilliant journalistic pieces, and perhaps at LeftWord we should collect a set of pieces on Engels the journalist, maybe one Marx the journalist, maybe one Engels the journalist, for people to learn this kind of proletarian, working class, socialist or communist journalism. I think would be quite valuable. So these are the two tracks of work that take Engels to the death of Marx in 1883. One track is working on the political economy, where they contribute together. The second is as a person trying to build the international working class movement, at its heart, the German Social Democratic Party. And here you see Marx and Engels spend a lot of time. They're both outside Germany. They have ban orders. They can't come in. They'd be arrested immediately. But from outside Germany, constantly trying to maintain the correct line in the German party, because as Engels says at a number of occasions, the German party is the most prestigious of the Marxist parties, and it should not be allowed to stray. There is a moment in, and Marx, when he's working on his on Capital and so on, is very much focused on that, and it's Engels who plays a role in maintaining the understanding of socialism and so on in a global way. Let me go to that second point and then come back to the Marx piece of it. What I was going to share a little bit is how Engels will write when the German Social Democratic Party decides to unify two wings that had been fighting with each other. One of them are the Lassallians, who are not Marxists, who don't have a Marxist understanding. Engels is quite frustrated, and he tries to argue, don't unite with them. And he writes a letter to August Bebel, one of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party. He says, there are circumstances in which one must have the courage to sacrifice momentary success for more important things. He says there's no need to unify with them because the most important thing is to maintain the integrity of our positions. We don't want to get swept up into idealism and utopianism. We want to maintain the proletarian point of view. He said that's very important. Eventually, they will unify and they will produce a program which is called the Gotha program. Engels writes the first critique of the Gotha program. It's an incredible critique. It's little known actually, because what's known is Marx's notes on the Gotha program, which Marx writes after talking to Engels and reading Engels' his text. Eventually, even Marx's critique of the Gotha program isn't published at that time, because they decide, let's build unity. Unity is more important in our movement than taking a sectarian position, but they have a very strong critique. So what you got to see is that from the last phase in Engels' life, he is the main person who's fighting to maintain the integrity of the proletarian line in the working class movement. It's Engels' job. You got to understand most of his writings, whether it's his incredible, work on attacking Lassalle, who was at the time one of the main, thinkers. If you look at his, the books that he writes about utopian socialism and so on. I mean, these texts are key texts because it's in these texts that he's not just writing about dialectics or writing about Marxism. He's trying to maintain the correct line against the kind of drift in the German Social Democratic Party. And at no point does Engels ever lose his revolutionary, sensibility. Later people say, well, Engels opens the door to his friend Bernstein. And this accusation is made of him without any real, if you read Engels' attack on the philosopher Dühring, which is called Anti-Dühring, published in 1882, first serialized, his attack on Feuerbach, published in 1888, and so on. These texts where he's developing dialectics and so on, but actually he's attacking these philosophers, whether it's Dühring or it's Feuerbach or others, to maintain the integrity of the line, to push a view that a revolution must be on the agenda, that you can't move in a kind of social democratic way and so on. Okay, I don't want to get more into that. I want to come back to, in the last bit, I want to come back to Capital. Okay, Capital. Marx is working on this incredible text. In 1857-58, he sits and he's writing notebook after notebook, hundreds of notebooks. These will later be known as the Grundrisse, the outline. They will not be published again until the 1930s. In 1857-58, he works out in the Grundrisse the method to understand capitalism and so on. He's quite sick. His family is living in poverty, and Engels essentially subsidizes them, uses the wealth of his father to subsidize Marx, gives Marx a sort of Engelsian fellowship over the years so Marx can work. Because Marx was the most indisciplined journalist. He never sent his things. And much of the journalism that Marx wrote in this period was written by Engels. Engels wrote it in Marx's name so that some money would come to the Marx family. A large section on Capital was published as a book in 1859 as the contribution. Okay, he publishes the section on Capital as a book in 1859. The contributions to the critique of political economy. Eventually, he publishes Capital 1867. I'm not getting into all the details of this, but I want to say that when Capital comes out, Friedrich Engels writes 9 book reviews of Capital because he is furious that it's not being taken seriously. His friend's work is not being taken seriously. When I first read this, it moved me greatly. Because there is something about friendship in our movement that I think I want to put on the table. Later Che Guevara will say a communist is somebody who's moved by love, great feelings of love. And what Che Guevara meant in a way was great feelings of love for humanity and abstraction, perhaps, for the future of our movement, but also great love for comrades. And when you read that Engels wrote 9 book reviews for Capital. Engels was the one who basically wrote letters to their comrades saying, review this book. This book is very important. Initially, nobody paid attention to it. It's Engels who fought to have it translated. It's Engels who wrote to people around the world and said, this must come in French, it must come in German, and so on. Marx was very sick in the period from 1867 to 1883. He wrote enormously and never shared it with Engels because he knew Engels would continually harass him to get it finished and published. After Marx died in 1883, Helen Demuth, who lived and worked with the Marx family, handed over to Engels enormous trove of manuscripts, including manuscripts that Engels looked at, and they looked like continuations of Capital Volume 1, which even between 1867 and 1883 had come out in several editions. Marx continued to revise Capital Volume 1 in the French edition, in the third German edition, and so on. It was never a finished book for him. But yet he had written all these other texts. And it's Engels who sat meticulously, and worked on what first became Capital Volume 1. And then for 10 years, he labored over what became Capital Volume 3. 10 years he worked on that book. It affected his health. It impacted his health deeply. He was very, very dedicated to getting that book finished. Now, um, I said I was going to say something about how Engels is made light of. Um, People say, well, he made all these mistakes in the putting together volume 2 and 3. We need a better edition, and so on. I find this very, very ingenuous as a assessment of Engels. Why do I find it ingenuous? Because Marx first trusted him implicitly and told Helen Dimert, give it to Freddie. Freddie will know what to do with this. He trusted him because they had worked out these ideas together. Because after all, Engels wasn't just the popularizer of Marxism. He had come with the major breakthrough that you have to write theory from the standpoint of the proletarians. That was a major theoretical breakthrough. That didn't come from Marx. That came from Frederick Engels. So Marx knew that this is a man of great capacity, that they had worked on these ideas together. Engels would know what to do. That's what he told Helen Dimert. Secondly, Engels had to deal with Marx's terrible handwriting and texts that sprawled all over the place. He had to somehow bring these together into a text that could be read by people, not just manuscripts. And he looked at Capital Volume 1, the third German edition, and said, if this is the last major text Marx has done, can I fashion the other two texts like this, similar kind of use of subheads and so on? And that's what one must focus on, is the way in which he struggled to put this text out there. And then he struggled to fight for the Marxist point of view subsequently, till his death in 1895. In this last period, he will look through Marx's manuscripts. He finds Marx's notes on Lewis Henry Morgan, on the importance of looking back anthropologically at the pre-capitalist, even primitive way in which people have organized human society. Lewis Henry Morgan had done ethnographic work among Native American peoples in the United States. Now, it's unfortunate that that becomes the basis of looking back to the human past. That's not necessarily so. I mean, Native Americans were contemporaneous with Morgan, but nonetheless, Engels reads Marx's very insightful notes, goes back, reads Morgan, and then spends a lot of time reading around Morgan and produces what he's best known for, which is the origin of the family, private property, and the state. That text is a collaborative text between Marx and Engels, because Engels only wrote it in a way to advance the notes that Marx had written. It's a great act of love, that text. And it's an incredible text because it shows you, it does a historical materialist analysis of the development of patriarchy and how patriarchy is rooted in and linked to capitalism. It's a very brilliant text, and I hope very much that you'll have reading groups and circles and so on. And I'm very sure that other lecturers in the following parts of the series will return to the origin of the family, private property, and the state. But the text was born out of Engels poring through Marx's unpublished manuscripts and discovering his notes on Lewis Henry Morgan. I mean, to me, that was a very moving thing to find. He's spending days and hours and years going through the manuscripts of Marx. He sees something brilliant. He says, I need to develop this and make a book. And that's what he does. I would say, in closing, if I was to say, what should you read of Engels in order to learn deeply from his thinking, I would say you must read The Condition of the Working Class in England. That should be an essential text. You should read his short text on the outline of the critique of political economy. I think you should definitely read Principles of Communism. Go back and read the Communist Manifesto. These are two sets of texts that are very important. I would say that if you have the stomach for it, you must read Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which is an extract essentially from Anti-Düring, an important defense of Marxism that Engels makes. And you must read The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. If I was to say, what is the essential Engels? What is the essential Engels? It's the early texts on English working class and on political economy. It's the texts on communism, the discovery of communism. It's the text on defending the dialectical method and on socialism. And then finally, it's the text on historical materialism and on the development of patriarchy inside capitalism. These are the four parts of an essential Engels. If we were to do a selected Engels, that's in a sense what we would have. So I'm grateful to you for spending this evening with me. Again, the farmers are, in Delhi. Their views are views that Engels would have used to develop his own understanding of what's happening today in India. He wouldn't be talking to the leader writer of the Economic Times. He wouldn't be talking to or listening to the finance minister. That's not where he would be getting his instructions. He would be getting his instructions from the agricultural workers, from the organization of the agricultural workers, the All India Agricultural Workers Union. He would be taking his lead from there. He would be building his understanding of the world from there. He knew the standpoint of thinking of the future, the standpoint of thinking of a communism is not coming from philosophy by itself. It's coming from the working class movement. The communist militant enters the working class movement, learns the consciousness of the working class, understandings of the working class, then elaborates that into philosophy, as part of the intellectual labor of that communist militant, and then reintroduces that philosophy back to the working class. That's exactly what Marx had done with Capital. He drew from Engels' research and his own understanding of the working class movement. He elaborated it into philosophy, the philosophy of political economy, Capital Volume 1, and then that book, that very significant book, he returns as his gift to the working class movement, where he says, now I have elaborated your own thinking into philosophy and I'm giving it back to you. Now go and make a revolution. Okay, comrades, thanks a lot. I suppose I should open the comments thing. Okay, good. Shankar, yes. When are we going to have an EMS Smriti again? What would be the influence of Engels on third world communist movement? Was there any insight in Engels' writing on imperialism, colonialism? Very good question. So, as you know, both Marx and Engels, and I have it here. I do have it here. Some time back, I suppose this was in 2001. At LeftWord, we produced a book edited by Ejaz Ahmed called Marx and Engels on the National and Colonial Question, Selected Writings. And in here, it's of course mainly Marx's writings, but in here there is a letter that Engels writes to Edward Bernstein. Now, what's interesting is, you see, both of them initially were focused on the European experience, both of them. But certain uprisings take place that inspired them greatly. The Indian uprising, 1857-58, very much inspired their thinking. The Irish uprising was very key. Now, you'll remember that Engels, when he was in Manchester, fell in love with a working class woman by the name of Lizzie Burns, with whom he would live. She was Irish, and she introduced Engels to the Irish question, first meeting Irish radicals in Manchester, and then understanding English colonialism of Ireland. So when you read Engels and you read Marx and so on, you may not see them writing, Engels particularly, about places outside Europe. He didn't write as much as Marx wrote outside places outside Europe, but they tackled the colonial question vis-a-vis Ireland. And here, of course, their idea was that that the colonial question is central to the struggle. I mean, that's where Lenin gets it from. When Lenin eventually will write about the importance of smashing the weak link in the imperialist chain, there's already evidence for that in Marx and Engels. And actually, the introduction by Ejaz Ahmed here will answer your question even better than I can. So I recommend this. I think it's still in print. If it's not, just write to me, Vijay@leftword.com, and we'll try to work it out for you. Okay, so that's that. Did the communism as propagated by Marx Engels anyway foresee the organic development of the proletariat? The proletariat never ceases to become and take on as a lifelong protest. This is an important question because yes, you see, firstly, in 1859, it's so interesting. Engels keeps reviewing Marx's books. In 1859, he reviewed Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy. And in that review, he writes a line. He says that, I won't be able to find it. Oh no, I found it. Lucky me. In 1859, in Das Volk, he writes a line. He says, history moves often in leaps and bounds and in a zigzag line, See, they actually didn't believe that history was in a straight line. You go from barbarism to the future. No, it goes zigzag. There are great defeats. And the proletariat, through trade unions, which are the school of the proletariat, that's how they understood it. The proletariat is constantly testing its thinking in struggle. Struggle is the great school. The trade union and the struggle is the great realization of you realize reality. You come to an understanding of reality when the struggle limits your advance, your ideas. There's no point having great ideas, by itself. You have a great idea, freedom. Farmers should be paid more. Then the farmers say we should be paid more. Then the state fires water cannons. That water cannon is the education, the limit of liberalism of the state. And then the movement will retreat, will think consciously, radicalize, come back with different kind of tactical maneuvers and so on. So in the writing of Engels and Marx, there is no finality, there is no certainty of anything. It all depends on the struggle of the working class, which is why they were so involved in building internationalist working class instruments and so on. It is a ceaseless, non-stop process. Trotskyites claim of Engels being the proponent of permanent revolution. Now, look, the idea of permanent revolution is actually quite a trivial idea, frankly. Because I don't know who doesn't accept that the revolution is permanent. Who doesn't accept that? This was used by Trotskyites. This idea was used by Trotsky and his followers to attack the notion inside the USSR about building socialism in one country. Look, in 1917, there's a revolution in the Tsarist Empire in February and then in October, proletarian revolution. The Soviet Republic is created. The Soviet Republic is immediately attacked by the imperialist forces. Secondly, there is an attempted revolution in Hungary. It fails. There is an attempted revolution in Germany. It fails. Attempted in Austria. It fails. Even one in Scotland, in Glasgow. The great red wave in Glasgow fails, crushed. So you're sitting in the Soviet Republic, you're looking around, you're Lenin, Stalin, all of them, Trotsky, looking around, and they see all revolutionary attempts are failing. The one that does succeed is Mongolia in 1919. But apart from the Tsarist Empire and Mongolia, there are no other communist revolutions. They are all failing. It's at that moment that they say we have to build our strength within, because we are getting attacked and it's not happening elsewhere. So we have to consolidate our strength. It's in that context that you have the new economic policy first, NEP under Lenin, and then later, the slogan of socialism in one country. It's not like Stalin believed that, there should not be a permanent revolution. It's just that it was not happening. This is a material situation. You can't will it out of your brain. It wasn't happening. So Trotsky goes into exile, and in Turkey, and then later in the United States and in Mexico, he will write the theory of the permanent revolution that's used by people to attack the USSR. But in fact, it's not like anybody in the USSR said that a permanent revolution is a bad thing. It's not that anybody said that. So this is a great mistake. Of course, in the writings of Engels, in the writing of Marx, the theory that revolution is a constant theme, that's there in all their writings. So I want us to take this permanent revolution concept in its context. It's used as a weapon to attack the Soviet Union at a particular point when the Soviet Union was being attacked and where other revolutions were not happening. If there had been a revolution in Germany, in Hungary, in Austria, and so on, then there would have been no need for the theory of permanent revolution, you see, because it would have been demonstrated in practice. Okay, talked about the methodological advance shift Engels brought. Is it possible to juxtapose that to Marx's critique of the division between mental and physical labor? Well, yes. So does the emphasis, that's true. You see, they had an understanding that every class, this is something that the communist philosopher, militant leader Antonio Gramsci will write about later. And by the way, we are just publishing from LeftWord the translation of Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad and P. Govindapillai's book on Gramsci. We're just publishing that in English after too long, after 20 plus 30 years of it being out in Malayalam. I just wrote an introduction for it where I made this point, which is that Gramsci says, and this is drawn directly from Marx and Engels' writings, that every class has its own intellectuals. And those are organic intellectuals. The intellectuals of the peasantry understand, nature, they understand the different forms of social life in their communities. Every class has its own intellectuals. There are traditional intellectuals who are intellectuals who get their authority based on their institutional place, priests, lawyers, whatever, those are people whose authority comes from the institutional location. Whereas organic intellectuals have to earn their authority in all classes. They have to keep earning their authority. What Gramsci writes, and drawing again from Engels and Marx, is that the role of the communist militant is the organic intellectual is to no longer be merely an organic intellectual, but to be a new intellectual, to go amongst the people, draw from the people their own thinking about their reality. Now, because people have a both limited time to develop their thinking into philosophy, they're working hard, leisure time is less, and also because they often struggle with contradictory consciousness. They have old thinking and so on. They don't have the time to elaborate their thinking. The militant goes among the people, draws their thoughts, elaborates into philosophy, and then returns to the people their thinking. That process of the elaboration of thought is the work of the militant, of the communist. And so this is exactly an acknowledgement that the people think. The people don't just do, they think. And it is their thought that produces the standpoint theory of Marxism. So yes, I think I would agree with you. A couple more. Okay, well, Jorge has asked about the text, The Dialectics of Nature. This is an unfinished book. Engels didn't finish this book. It was published after his lifetime. And I have to say, it didn't have an Engels, somebody who would come and lovingly put the book together like he put Marx's books together. But it's still an important text. I'm not an expert in science, so I'm going to ask you to go and read Probir Purkasta's essay in the current issue of People's Democracy. If you'd like, I can put it in the chat. You can easily find it. No, I'll put it in the chat. I would highly recommend you go and read Comrade Probir's essay, because I'm not a scientist, and one of the things I've learned is you should try to only talk about things you know properly. I'm going to put both Comrade Probir's piece in the chat and Comrade Brinda's piece in the chat on Engels and women's emancipation, and I think it would be very good if you could have a read of these. I'm going to do one more question, and then I have to leave you, if that's okay. Rafiq, if that's fine, I hope that's okay. Jaya Lakshmi is asking, would you comment on how Marx and Engels approached the issue of capitalist use of natural resources, relevance of their approach in the contemporary context of environmental degradation? This is an excellent question. And as with many things, I like to not answer things I don't know about very well. But I have read this book very carefully. It's by Kohei Saito, and it's called Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. The subtitle is Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy. This is published in India, unfortunately not published by LeftWord, to my great consternation. It's a very interesting book because what Kohei Saito does, and I know that on the monthly review site, he has written an essay where he summarizes, I'm going to put it in the chat. He summarizes his, his thinking, and I'm going to find it for you, and I'll put it in the chat here. This is actually interesting. This is his review of a book called Marx and the Earth. Kohei Saito is a fascinating Japanese Marxist who has been writing a lot about Marx and Marxist thinkings about here. I'm going to put two things for you to read. Okay. And again, I'm just doing this, you see, because, see, Jaya Lakshmi, as I said already, and I'm going to repeat it, I don't like to say things about which I don't know very much, because we've got to be a little clear and precise. And I don't really know this apart from having read this book 3 times. But anyway, I think it's a misunderstanding to believe that Marx and Engels believed that nature should be just, utilized and brutalized and used for human purposes. Marx, in his writings, has this concept of the metabolism, the human nature, the unification of human and nature, and doesn't believe that humanity should just develop the productive forces and destroy the planet. That's exactly not what he writes about. And later in his manuscripts, his ecological manuscripts, which he writes later in his life, which I remember reading for my PhD, he writes about the science of chemistry and fertilizers, and he writes with great feeling about how the soil must not be degraded. And degraded soil is just going to mean that the limit of capital, as he writes in the Grundrisse, is capital itself. And he takes a very severe position against the degradation of soil and of the use of chemical fertilizer. Now, that doesn't mean we don't use chemical fertilizer. It's how you do these things. There is a very good balanced understanding. It's not a completely don't use science to understand agriculture and so on. No, you must use science, but not to destroy nature. There is a barrier that must be there. So again, go read Kohei Saito's work. I think you will find it very interesting. And with that, I will leave you. And yes, Srijit and Rafiq, we can talk to each other in a day or so. Sure. If I get to Caracas, we can talk from Caracas. How's that? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thanks, comrades.